Hello, everybody, and welcome to Craftsy Chat. My name is Leah, and I am so glad that you joined us today. In just a moment, I'm going to be bringing on our cookie decorating instructor, Ann Yorks. But before we say hello to Ann, I would like to give you just a little heads up about a fun free download that you can get right now. It's titled Essential Royal Icing Techniques for Stunning Sugar Cookies. So if that sounds just as exciting to you as it does to me, you can grab that download right now. Check out that link in the description or anywhere where you're viewing this. And with that said, I'd like to jump right into today's event. Hello, Ann, and welcome. How are you doing today?
Hey, Leah. I am doing awesome. I actually just got done baking, so my kitchen smells like sugar cookies, which is always a good place to be.
Fantastic. Oh, I love that smell myself. Before we get started, I just would like to let everybody know you can feed your questions into the question box and I will send them on through to Ann. But how has baking been going for you, Ann? Give us a little update on what's been going on.
Yeah, well, in the cookie world, everything is so seasonal. And so we just got through the holidays, and Valentine's Day is a huge cookie event. And now we're looking at all of these spring celebrations coming up, and our color palettes are really changing. A lot more pastels and bright colors, and we're moving away from the red and white finally. So that's a good place to be. We have Easter coming, Mother's Day, graduation. May is such a big month for dance recitals. So there's just a lot happening in the spring to be making cookies for.
Great. And if somebody is just starting out with cookies, so maybe they missed the winter holiday cooking baking extravaganza, what would you say to somebody that's just jumping in for these pastel colors? Any immediate tips that come to mind?
Yeah, this is a great season to start decorating cookies. And my number one tip is to keep that first project simple, to not overcomplicate it. It's easy to look on Pinterest or Instagram and see a ton of stunning cookies, but to really practice making that royal icing and baking those first couple of batches of cookies, I always suggest to new decorators that they choose one design and 3 to 4 icing colors. The repetition of doing that same design over and over again really builds confidence as you move into future projects. Now, with making those pastels, I like to use the concentrated food gels. I use the Chef Master brand, but Wilton or Americolor, they all work really great. And to create those pastels, it only takes a teeny tiny dot. So if you're new to decorating, making those icing colors is a little bit of a learning curve. And really what I always suggest is I have like a little pink cookie decorating tool, or if you have a spatula, I will suggest to make those pastels, just put that dot of color directly on your spatula. Don't put it right into your icing. Then you can really control those colors and how deep they're going to get. So definitely keep it simple if it's your first project.
Great. And as your questions are coming in, just a reminder, you can grab that download. We have Ann Yorks with us today. If you're just joining us, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're talking all things cookie decorating. And Ann has promised us that she could talk about cookies for, I believe, years.
Yes, definitely years. I haven't tried it. Well, maybe I've been talking about it for probably 10 years straight.
So the good news is you get all of your answers from Ann here today. And we do have our first question coming in from Kenna right now. And Kenna would like to have any tips you have for shipping sugar cookies.
Yeah. So when I ship cookies, it is really key to make sure that there's just no movement in that shipping box. If your cookies can move, they can break. So I suggest wrapping each cookie in bubble wrap and then putting crinkle paper or packing peanuts in your shipping box to keep those cookies from moving around. I am very cautious, and so I actually double box my cookies. I'll put the cookies in one box and then cushion that box inside of a second box. That might be a little bit extreme, but I can tell you that I do not ever have broken cookies when I ship them. The cookie class that I did for Craftsy, Smart Cookies, you can find it on craftsy.com. I actually do a really great demo on how to ship cookies in that class and show how I pack up those cookies and cushion everything. I will also say that sometimes a really soft cookie, so depending on what your recipe is, if you have a really soft and chewy style cookie, that is going to have a higher chance of breaking. And so maybe even baking your cookies a little bit longer than you normally would, add on 30 seconds or a minute just to get kind of that nice brown bottom on the bottom of that cookie will help that cookie to be sturdy. Actually, I have an example of one of those bubble pouches here. The cookie would be wrapped, but you can just slide that cookie in there, and I call it cookie armor because it pretty much just keeps those details from scraping off when they're in their box shipping. So that's what I recommend for shipping cookies.
I can actually vouch for that double boxing that you mentioned because that's how I received some cookies myself, and it was fantastic. So it might be a little bit extra, but it's a step that works.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, let's move to Elisa's next question here. Elisa saw some new tips at Walmart, plus Wilton flavors. Have you seen them?
No, I'd love to see them. I'd love to see pictures. I'm curious about the flavors for sure. And I'm wondering about those tips. Can she give us more details on that?
Yeah, Elisa, pop in some more details so that Anne will have a little bit more to go on. That sounds pretty exciting. I'm going to feed in a question specific to royal icing since that's our download today. I know, Anne, you've talked before about the consistency of that royal icing. Again, for beginners, if there's something that right off the bat is a great tip for beginning with that royal icing, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So on the Craftsy YouTube page, I do a great overview of royal icing consistencies. And sometimes it's just really helpful to visually see that icing. But generally, when I am working with new decorators, I like to compare those icing consistencies to food that they're already kind of aware of what those consistencies are. So generally, I like to use a thicker piping icing, and I put a tip on the icing bag. This is what I would use for the outlines and the details on the cookies. So it's a little bit thicker, and I compared that icing consistency to a soft serve ice cream. So it has a little bit of motion, but it really kind of holds its shape. If you can visualize that little loop on the top of the soft serve, that's the goal for that soft peak piping icing. It'll be nice and easy on your hands, but it will still hold its shape when you're piping your details. Then the second really common icing consistency that's great for a beginner to master is that flood icing. And so on the cookie, you have like this nice flat surface. It's that flood icing that flows onto the surface of the cookie to make that nice flat surface. And so I like to compare that to a honey. It's not watery, so you don't want your icing too thin. Thin icing can cause problems, but it does have a flow. It will flow off your spatula. And so I always encourage people to just do a 10-second test with their spatula. If they have their icing bowl and they pull their spatula through that icing, it will create a line in their icing. It should take about 10 seconds for that icing line to disappear, for that icing to kind of flow closed. That's when you know it's not too thin and it's not too thick and it's ready to go on the cookie.
And Kate has a follow-up question about how long should royal icing dry between layers?
Yeah, generally I use a fan to dry my icing. And so I usually just work through my cookies. If I'm doing a couple dozen cookies, I'll work through that first sheet and put it in front of a fan. And then about an hour later, I feel like I'm ready to move on to that next step. Now, that's kind of a very general thing. When you have cookies that have small icing areas, like for example, this little chick has a darker yellow wing on it, that wouldn't take an hour to dry, in 30 minutes, you'd be ready to move on to the next step. But generally those larger icing areas, before I add details, I let it dry for an hour in front of the fan just so that it's set up, and it really prevents icing bleeding. So if, for example, this bunny has white and black, if you try to pipe those black details on that white background too soon, you'll see a little bit of color bleeding. And after you go through all that work to make these really amazing, impressive cookies, the last thing you want is to have a situation like that can be prevented just by letting it dry for about an hour in front of the fan.
Now, for people that are like me that might have a little issue with patience per se, is there a test that helps? Just visual, anything that you would have to be able to see when it's ready, or should we just be patient and take that time?
Definitely try to dig down deep and have some of that patience. But, you can really see when the icing goes on, that flood icing goes on, it looks very wet and it has a lot of shine to it. And then the top of the icing will start to crust over. And I always tell students, it's kind of like thin ice. Like it looks like it's dry because it's dry on the top, but it's still very wet underneath. So you'll see a crust on the surface of the icing. It's not quite so shiny. You can probably gently touch it with a finger. But if you're not careful when you go to add those details, you could definitely poke through. This little tip can go through the surface of the icing. So even with allowing for an hour, it might look dry on the top. You visually can see that it's dry. It has a crust. But you need to take a little bit of care with those icing tips.
Jenna just popped a comment in. Jenna, I feel you. She says, waiting so long for the icing to dry when she's doing small batches really tests my patience. Jenna, know that I feel you.
I get it.
Let's get to Sue's question here. Still on icing. I'm still struggling somewhat with icing consistency, but even when I get it right, it seems to dry so very hard. Is there something that I'm doing wrong?
There's not something that you're doing wrong, but there are things that you can do to get a softer bite. And so I typically like to use just a real classic royal icing recipe with the meringue powder, but it does dry almost like a candy. And if that's not the texture that you like to bite into, you can get a softer bite by adding a teaspoon of glycerin to your icing. And that just gives it a little bit more elasticity and makes that bite a little bit softer. Now, you don't want to add too much. If you do, it can kind of mess with how the icing dries or maybe even prevent the icing from drying. So I say start small with 1 teaspoon in a single batch of royal icing and just see if you notice a difference in that crunch when you're biting into your icing. Some people also add a teaspoon of corn syrup, not just for a softer bite, but also for shine on the surface of the cookie. I prefer to keep things super simple and easy, and so I don't choose to add those things, but there are obviously a lot of different ways to make royal icing and lots of different recipes out there. So playing around with those 2 ingredients might give you another option that you like better.
This actually leads us right into our next question coming in from Lisa. You mentioned a little bit about shine, and Lisa says, hi, Anne. Any idea why my royal icing dries dull? Your cookies are beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So when I first started decorating cookies almost 13 years ago, I would just decorate the cookies and leave them out on the tabletop for the icing to dry. There is nothing wrong with doing that way, and your cookies will look very cute. But when you let them dry naturally like that, they will have more of a matte finish. So if you're looking to get more of a shine, I just mentioned, you can add a teaspoon of corn syrup to your icing recipe for more shine. You can also include in your process some sort of way of speeding up that drying time. There is something about that fast moving air that a fan provides that just adds that shine to the surface of that icing. So I prefer to use a floor fan, and I'm constantly cleaning it because I don't want any dust or anything on that fan, but I have it in front of my bakery rack, and that's blowing across the cookies, and that fast moving air just kind of speed dries the surface of that icing and keeps that shine. There are other ways to dry cookies that are a little bit more involved, like using a food dehydrator. That might not be more involved, but it's definitely more expensive than a fan you can buy at Walmart. So if you're just doing this as a hobby, that might not be an investment that you're looking into. But Georgianne Bell from Lila Loa, she is also a Craftsy cookie decorating instructor, has a great blog post on how to use a food dehydrator with your cookies and really kind of maximizing that shine. So the shine, definitely you can impact it with your recipe by adding the corn syrup. Then also consider, how are you drying your cookies, and can you implement a fan or some other drying agent to help speed up that drying to get that shine? That's what I would recommend.
All right, great. Ooh, we have a little creative question coming in next, and this one's from Carol. Carol asks, how do you come up with such cute designs? I've done a bunch from Pinterest, and I want to do something original, but it always comes out like a child decorated it.
It takes a little bit of practice, because my first couple of designs that I did on my own, some were successful and some were just a learning experience. But imitating decorators that I admired in the beginning was a great way for me to learn the decorating process. Then when I was ready to start designing my own cookies, I learned a few things: that setting boundaries is really helpful. Sometimes limiting how many icing colors you're planning really helps to create a very cohesive cookie design. And so I actually have my little sketchbook here with me, and this is an Easter candy set that I just did. And I kept the color palette really simple. They don't have to be complicated, but when you plan those icing colors ahead of time, these are simple cookies that anybody can do. But it's the color palette that really brings that cookie set together. And so when I'm sketching my cookies, I will pull out just the colors that I'm planning to use from my color pencil box. I find cookie inspiration everywhere. I almost think I have like cookie vision. So I can be inspired by something in nature. I will go to Target and walk around and take pictures of things that are in their seasonal aisle that are really cute. Greeting cards and wrapping paper and clip art. Those are all great places for inspiration. But a lot of times I get the most joy out of cookie decorating when I create my own design. That's something that I really like to do. And so here's this little chick that I keep showing. That's her sketch. I just have notes. These are my icing color notes. So this little chick is actually a penguin cookie cutter. And when I was trying to think about what cookie I wanted to make, I really wanted to make a really happy chick. That's what I call that cookie, is happy chick. And so I just really started brainstorming, like, what cookie cutter shape? And I will actually just trace that cookie cutter directly into my sketchbook and then start playing around with the designs, maybe inspired by something from the store or a greeting card. But those are kind of the general tips that kind of the process that I like to go through. I do talk about cookie design also in that Smart Cookies class on craftsy.com. And I do a sketching demo, and I talk about planning cookie sets and how to plan something interesting to look at, but then also some accent cookies that are easy to decorate, that come together kind of quickly to keep the whole process manageable. I think that Smart Cookies class is my favorite class that I've done, because it has so many practical tips about the cookie decorating process. So if you haven't checked that out, I would recommend that being your next class that you go to.
All right, we're going to veer right back into the world of icing with our next question here from Ashley. Ashley wants to know, how do you keep royal icing from bleeding? I struggle with this.
Yeah. So here's a couple tips that I have done that really work well for me. The first thing is, when I'm making my icing, I actually add white food gel to my mixing bowl before I scrape out the icing and make all the icing colors. And that surprises people sometimes. You even add white to black, or red or navy. Yes, there's something about that white icing that just makes my icing colors nice and opaque and really hold their color very well, including the white icing. And so that's the first step, is to kind of tackle it from when you are mixing the icing. Add that white in there to keep those colors nice and strong. The second thing is the dry time. We just talked about that. And if you're just joining us, just to recap, allowing those icing areas to dry before you move on to the next part of the cookie will really reduce the wet icing from touching each other and leaching color into each other. And so when you allow different icing areas to dry, it really eliminates that color bleeding. And then same thing with the details. You want to make sure you have a nice dry surface before you go in, especially with highly contrasting colors. You don't want to have a black on a white that was just flooded. You'll definitely see some color bleeding that way as well. So just being conscious of how dry that icing is before you add your details. Finally, I have noticed that when I let my cookies dry in front of the fan for about an hour, then I will keep them out on the bakery rack before I store them overnight in a cool oven. Just letting that icing dry really also reduces the color bleeding. If you pack your cookies too soon, the moisture from the icing, the moisture from the cookie kind of get all juiced up inside your cookie packaging. I'm not sure if that's an official cookie term, juiced up. Just made that one up. But it kind of, all that moisture is mixing up there together and it's trapped in your cookie packaging. And so you just want to really make sure. I let my cookie, my icing dry for 18 hours before I pack the cookie. If I don't, I'll see the package stick to it, and I'll also see some of that color bleeding. So those are some great tips to hopefully reduce that, or maybe even just eliminate it.
All right, let's move. Oh, another Leah is out there. Leah wants to know about your favorite cookie cutter, Anne, if you've got one, and specifically if you've got one that can be flipped and used for several different designs.
Yeah, probably the cupcake with swirl. And I did use that cookie cutter in my first Craftsy class, Celebrate with Cookies, and it is actually a cupcake. But if you search on the Flowerbox blog, you will find that cookie cutter probably 18 different ways. I've done it as if you flip it upside down, I've done it as a Santa and a leprechaun. If you use it during the fall, it can be a bushel of apples. And so I find that that cupcake with swirl is a super affordable cookie. It's made by Anne Clark, and they're an amazing company in Vermont. And that is probably my favorite cookie cutter that I've used the most. And then, of course, as a cupcake, it just makes a cute cookie. And you can do that in so many different colors to coordinate really with any celebration. So I think that's my favorite one.
All right, we're going to continue on with everybody's questions, but if you are just joining us, quick reminder, there is a download available for you that you can click on and get at any time. And then also, as questions come to you, drop them into the chat box so that I can get those questions into Anne as we continue today's Craftsy Chat. With that said, we're going to hop right into our next question from Kenna. And this is great. This is a class you've mentioned a few times, Anne. It's about your Smart Cookie class. Kenna wants to know if it's a good class for beginners.
I think it's a great class for beginners because not only does the class really jump into the more practical side of the process of cookie decorating and things to think about, like what happens before you actually decorate cookies. I spent a lot of time walking you through those steps. It's also full of cookie demos, and so I show a lot of interesting techniques and how to sort of decorate smarter, not harder, is sort of the goal with that class. So I think it's a great class for beginners, just because it's a good mix of really practical information on how to go through the cookie decorating process. And then there's lots of fun demos where you can pick up some new techniques.
All right, so go ahead and check out that Smart Cookie class if you're curious about more. I know Anne has mentioned it a few times today, so that seems like a good next stop for you if you're just joining us. I would like to ask a question about any bakers that are experiencing small space baking, especially as we are just finishing up with winter, maybe people are still inside. And if you only have a small space, what are some tips that you have for people that are baking perhaps big batches as they're getting ready to send out their spring cookies?
Yeah, when I first started my business, we had a very small kitchen and we also had a family living in it. So there was a little bit of a juggle how to work around the family and so forth. So, one of the things that I found very helpful is just stacking cookie sheets like this. I don't know, cattywampus. I don't even know if that's what cattywampus means. It's just a fun word to say, but stacking those sheets, and I would keep my cookies stacked up vertically. I didn't even have room for a bakery rack. My kitchen was so small. So I would just keep those cookie sheets stacked on my countertop and work through each one as I was working through those big projects. They do actually now, this was from 13 years ago, but they do actually make a half baking rack. And I'm sure you can find it maybe on Amazon or webstore.com. I'm not sure. But that is a half-sized rack. So if you're working on larger cookie projects, that could be a great space saver option. In that first kitchen, I used to keep all of my baking supplies and cookie cutters labeled in baskets up on the top of my cabinets. And so that was space that I wasn't really using at that time, that my family didn't need. And I would just keep everything kind of up above. And then eventually, I grew out of that space and we did move into a bigger space. But one of the challenges with that space when you're working on a project that's more than 3 or 4 dozen cookies, maybe you're working on a 10 dozen project, you're doing a project for a bridal shower or a corporate event. I found that baking in that small home oven could sometimes be a challenge. I did use half cookie sheets when I was baking, and I did have both racks in the oven. And halfway through, I would just rotate those cookie sheets so that the cookie sheets would be baking evenly. While I found that I could usually roll faster than my oven could bake. And so I would actually store those cookie sheets with my rolled out cookies in my fridge. That dough was just chilling, ready to go into the oven. Not only was that a great space to store those cookie sheets, but my cookies also really kept their shape because that dough is being chilled right before it was being baked. But you don't need a huge space to go through the cookie decorating process. I talked about that floor fan, but I actually have this little tabletop fan, and you could even get something little like that on Amazon. Of course, I have to get pink. But even a little tabletop fan like that, you can just put on your kitchen table and set your cookie tray in front of that. So it doesn't have to be some big, overwhelming craft. There's a lot that you can get by with what you already have in this space that you have. You can make the best of it.
Ooh, a good question coming in from Jenna next. What other flavors of cookies can we decorate on? I know chocolate chip won't work, but what about snickerdoodle, etc.?
Yeah, actually, you can do chocolate chip because you can get those really itty bitty mini chocolate chips, and you can add that into your sugar cookie dough and roll it out, and it actually does still work. You'll still have a pretty flat surface for that. The sky is the limit when it comes to cookie flavors. You can definitely do lemon. I know that's one of my personal favorite flavors. But just, snickerdoodle, and a lot of times just modifying. So if your recipe traditionally calls for vanilla, you could substitute that out and add in fresh lemon juice or a combination of lemon juice and lemon extract. I'm curious about that question that came in about the person that said they saw new flavors from Wilton at Walmart. I have seen little flavor bites. So it's almost like like a chocolate chip, but really, really tiny. And I've seen them in blueberry and birthday cake. And again, this is something, it's kind of an additive that you add to your sugar cookie dough. It still gives you a nice flat surface from after they're done baking, but you can add in a blueberry flavor, birthday cake flavor, or a cinnamon flavor. So those are fun. I've seen those actually at Michael's. And then just getting creative, if you want to test your own flavors, like adding toffee pieces, for example, if you have a favorite flavor and just trying to figure out how does that work. There's an annual event called CookieCon, and this is an international, I say international because it sounds more official, but people really do come from outside of the United States, and then the majority of the people are from the United States. But it's just like this huge gathering of cookie decorators. And my favorite part of that event is there is a cookie tasting on Saturday morning, and you get all these little 1-inch cookies and, red velvet with cream cheese frosting. There was a bacon flavored cookie one year. And so you really can get pretty creative. There are a ton of bloggers out there that do share recipes. Some of the really best recipes I have found you can even pay for them. A brown butter snickerdoodle recipe that I tried that I loved. So yeah, you don't have to stick with just vanilla. I love vanilla. Vanilla is my favorite. People call it boring. I don't think it's boring at all. I think it's delicious. But you don't have to stick with just vanilla flavor when it comes to decorated cookies.
All right, let's move into a question again about icing. This one's about color. Comes in from Latit, and Latit wants to know, how do you mix colors to make something special you want? Like, any tips for creating colors that do not come from the store? It looks like gold is the aim color here.
Yeah. Well, there are actually a lot of icing color charts that are really helpful tools. And I use the icing color charts in my cookie decorating season by season class with Craftsy to show how to take a really specific color palette and add 2 dots from one gel and 2 dots from another gel to get a very specific shade of color. That was from the winter lesson in that class. And so those color charts are pretty awesome for mixing custom colors. For something like gold, there is a gold food gel, but it's not a shiny gold. And so that will just make a matte style gold, but you can actually paint on royal icing with metallics. And so there are FDA approved dusts that you can mix with either alcohol or an extract and paint those details onto your cookie. So if this is, for example, a bridal shower event or a graduation project and you want gold accents, you would pipe those details in the gold piping icing, but it wouldn't be shiny yet until you went on and added those accents. And I'm pretty sure there are gold accents also in that season by season class. I add some gold accents to a fall cookie in that class. But I do have an example of those color charts that you can get. These are just 2 but these color charts have all of the different colors, or you can just spin your wheel to see, what do you need to mix to get a specific color. So that's kind of metallics and custom colors. I will say this, though, color mixing is really not my favorite part of the process. I really like the decorating part. And so I like to keep my color palette super simple. Like I told you, I'll only pull out 5 pencils from my colored pencil box when I'm planning my cookies because I really want to have a narrow, specific palette for a project. And I find that I get the most joy when I just use the color straight out of the bottle. And I'm amazed and how many shades actually come out of one bottle. And so when it's not for a custom project, like a wedding event where they have a custom specific color that they're looking to do, I find just coloring direct from the bottle is, for me, a huge time saver. If for some reason you run out of icing, it's really easy to remix and match that shade if it's coming directly from that food gel bottle.
All right. Oh, Lauren has a question about business. So, do you have any tips for starting a home-based cookie business?
Yes. So when I first started, it was such an exciting time, but it seemed like there was this huge mountain that I needed to climb to get to success, maybe. And so the first thing that I would suggest is take care of the essential tasks for setting up your business before you start focusing on actually jumping in and doing that business. So the cottage food laws, depending on where you're located, they vary from state to state. And that's probably the first thing that you want to look at if you're looking from working from home. Here in Pennsylvania, when you go through that process, I found that the people at the Department of Food Safety were extremely friendly and helpful. I was very nervous to make that first phone call. And so I found that they were very helpful. I needed to contact my zoning office and get the zoning permit for having a business out of my house. So just making a list and going through those steps, setting up your own business account at your bank and those types of things are really helpful to take care of those business tasks. There is a class on Craftsy from Michelle Green. She is a cake decorator, and this class focuses specifically on the business side of baking. I highly recommend that class. Michelle's an excellent instructor, and I think you would really enjoy that. So once your ducks are sort of in a row and you have that business side, you have your kitchen, you're allowed to produce food out of your kitchen, or you have a space that you're renting that you can do your business out of, then I feel like it's time to start thinking about what kind of cookie business do you want to be. And in my experience, there were really kind of two sides to the cookie business. There was the custom cookie projects. So those were sort of special events that people would hire me to make cookies for their special event. And then there were the holiday cookies. Their holiday cookies and corporate orders have a lot in common. And for me, I found focusing on the holiday cookies and the corporate orders was where my business was the most profitable, because you can really streamline that cookie process. You determine what the cookie designs are and communicate to your customer that these are the designs that they can choose from. And that is very helpful. It eliminates a lot of back and forth between you and the customer that those custom projects offer. So custom cookie orders are not bad. They're actually really fun for your creativity. And I found that those were really fun to mix in with those holidays. But my effort was really spent on planning for holidays and maximizing those events. I would think through, okay, my space, I can make 60 dozen cookies in a week. And so I would plan my cookie designs. Maybe I'll have 3 different selections that the customer could choose from. Plan as many shared icing colors as possible just to kind of streamline and share that work. So I could probably talk, that's a pretty broad question there, but I could probably talk about that for a long time. But I hope those are just a few things to think about, is just kind of getting the business set up in the right way first, and then really kind of thinking through, how are you actually going to make a profit? How much does it cost to make that cookie and produce it? Making a really extravagant cookie is a lot of fun, but it's usually not going to make you any money.
So there's a trade-off there.
There is.
Well, I think those are great beginning tips if you're thinking about a home cookie business. So thank you. Oh, and you did mention, and I'll tag on with Jan's question, one of the cake decorators on Craftsy. Jan wants to know, have you ever thought about going into cake or cupcake decorating?
Not really, to be honest, because there is for me a difference in the canvas. And so I'm used to like this little 3 or 4 inch canvas that's flat on my table. And I am not into sculpting and those kinds of things. So, for me, I don't know, it just helps me to have a focus. And so I love to just focus on cookies, and that's what I've always focused on. I do make cupcakes and cakes for my own family, but it's not something that I've done as a business. And I have to be honest, when I do make cakes, I decorate them with cookies. So I'm still not even really decorating the cake because I just have a blank canvas and then I put cookie pops and things like that in the top. And so, yeah, cupcakes, I love to eat them. I love cakes, but that's not really my specialty. My specialty is definitely cookie decorating, and I'm okay with that.
Perfect. I like the idea of decorating a cake with cookies.
Yes, I'm a cheater.
All right, our next question comes in from Jenny. Jenny's curious how long it takes you to decorate a single cookie, and do you get fatigued?
Oh, yes. Cookie decorating is a labor of love. And so I do find that depending on what I'm decorating, rolling out cookies or hunching over and I really have to pay attention to my posture when I'm decorating, my hands and just like the strength of my hands of constant squeezing. I find that I'm massaging my hands a lot just to give those muscles some relief. And so getting other people involved in the cookie decorating process, if you are a business, can be very helpful. The flooding phase is a great place to invite somebody in to help with that process, because once you've outlined that cookie, it's almost like a coloring book, and somebody else can easily flood that in and share that work with you. And then it's up to you to do the details. So, what was the first part of that question? It wasn't just physical, though. It was,
How long does it take you to do
yes.
one cookie?
Well, it is hard to say because it's such a process from when do you count that time per cookie from when you mix the dough to when you wrap that final cookie. And so, 4 dozen cookies, total time from starting to mix that dough to the very last cookie being wrapped. I would usually estimate that it takes 6 to 7 hours. There's a lot of inactive time. And obviously, when you start scaling up and sharing icing colors and working in an assembly line, the per cookie time really decreases. A cookie like this Peep, that one doesn't, you could probably accomplish that in under a minute as far as the actual decorating time. A cookie like our Happy Chick, she's probably more like 5 to 7 minutes if you really sat down and did the calculations. One of the things that I did when I first started my cookie business was I actually timed myself. And that sounds really ridiculous, but I needed to know, how much time do I need to plan for when I'm mixing dough? How much time do I need to plan for when I am flooding in my cookies? And so I would find kind of an average time of what it would take me to go through for an average cookie order. And that really helped me to plan my week out, that I would know, okay, on Tuesday from 6 a.m. to noon, I'm outlining and flooding 200 cookies. And I know I generally can get that done in that time because I've timed myself. So.
Right, that's the timing tip. That is really, I like that one quite a bit. I hope that's helpful for people viewing out there. A little thank you coming in from Jenna about backing up to all of your comments about those flavor combinations. That is great. And then Corinne asks if you know of some organic food coloring.
For food gels, actually, Chef Master has a line of naturals. And so I wish it wasn't like this, but it is quite a bit more expensive for those natural food gels. But for some customers, if they have an allergy or a sensitivity, it is worth the expense. So I would check out the Chef Master Naturals, and I'm sure you can find it on their website or even on Amazon and order natural food gels from them. And they would have the details on what the ingredients are as well on the page.
I'm going to jump right into Laura's question next because to tag on your allergy comment that you just said, Laura's curious about any royal frosting substitutes for people with egg allergies.
Yes, I haven't actually personally tried this, but I do follow a few vegan cookie decorators, and the juice from chickpeas actually makes a great substitute for the egg whites or the meringue powder. And so I'm sure if you Googled vegan royal icing recipe, you'll be able to find about how much of that liquid should be added to make that royal icing. But that's a good substitution.
All right, thank you for that too. Nancy's got a question about stencils. So, Anne, if you are stenciling more than 20 cookies, should you have more than one stencil?
No, you shouldn't. One stencil is definitely sufficient. And I love stenciling cookies because it's such a time saver. I find when I'm stenciling, before I lift that stencil with my icing scraper, I'll pass over the surface of that stencil one last time and kind of pick up any of the excess icing before I peel back the stencil. If I remove that excess, I can usually do 18 to 24 cookies with the same stencil without washing it. And so it really, I've done 30 cookies in under a half an hour, which is like phenomenal when we were just talking about, cookies taking 5 to 7 minutes. Stenciling is such a time saver, but really the key is removing that excess icing so that you can reuse that stencil over and over from cookie to cookie. And you'll start to know when it's time to stop and wash your stencil when you start seeing the image is a little bit blurry or you see some icing on the underneath side of the stencil. Then I'll just rinse the stencil under hot water, rinse off all the icing. I'll put it in a paper towel sandwich and get it all the way dried up. And then I'm ready to just keep on going. So I don't recommend buying more than one stencil of the same design. I don't find that that's really helpful unless you were doing like a 300 cookie project and you really just wanted to like motor through and get them done. But if you're just doing a couple dozen cookies, one stencil is definitely sufficient.
Great. Oh, we have another thank you in here for the business information that you were giving us a little bit earlier, Anne. And
Awesome.
I am going to take a quick peek at the clock. We do have time for a few more questions. So if you've been holding on to a question for Anne and you'd like to get it into the chat box, now is the time as we start to get towards the end of our time together. So that's your last little reminder to put in your last minute questions. And with that said, we're going to jump in. Lisa has our next question here. Lisa asks, have you ever used an electric dough sheeter? And do you have any thoughts on it? Because I am doing 1,500 cookies for Easter. So she would love some tips from you, Anne. And thanks you for all the knowledge that's out here.
Yeah, Lisa, that's a lot to roll out. 1,500 cookies certainly would be an effort. I personally have not used a sheeter, but I know that larger bakeries do use them. The Painted Cookie in Connecticut, for example, I know she has a sheeter that she loves. I know people have also used clay sheeters, but I don't think they're food safe. So you have to be careful when you're looking for options. Sometimes the dough sheeters, cookie dough sheeters, you're going to find or have a little bit of a higher price point than other types of sheeters that you can find in the market. But no, I personally haven't tried a sheeter, but I would love to. I just asked my husband to help. Is that terrible? Get somebody else to help you with those, Lisa, if you don't get a sheeter.
Do a little delegating.
Yes.
And this is also something, if anyone out there viewing has used a sheeter and you want to put some details into the chat box, feel free to be searching the chat box for some crowdsourcing as well. Let's go into Carol's question next. Are there other types of icing to decorate with, and what are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely lots of types of icing to decorate with. On cookies, I think the three most common types of icing that I have seen is royal icing, which is what I prefer to use. I've also seen people decorate with buttercream. And also a glaze icing. So the difference between those three, I'll tell you what the benefits are and maybe what the drawback might be. The royal icing I love because I find that you get minimal color bleeding. It dries nice and smooth like a candy, which means you can pack and ship your cookies and the icing won't stick to the cookie packaging. So I just love the way royal icing looks and behaves when I'm working with it, which is why, for the most part, that's what I exclusively like to use. But buttercream is very tasty. And so I think in the taste category, you're going to find the buttercream is going to win. And so that's a huge benefit of the buttercream. With buttercream, you will see some crusting on buttercream, but it's not going to dry the same way as royal icing. I would be a little bit hesitant and maybe extra careful if I were shipping that kind of a cookie. But you could certainly, the icing would set up enough that you could probably stack your cookies on a platter and it would be successful. The third type I mentioned is glaze. This type of icing does not have meringue powder in it, and so it doesn't dry completely like the royal icing does. But some people are really turned off by that flavor of the meringue powder. So again, it's a flavor advantage for the glaze. There are also hybrids of those. People have made icing that have some of these qualities and some of those qualities. So there are a ton of types of icing out there, but I would say when it comes to cookie decorating, those are the three most common types.
All right. Trying to get through these last few questions here. One comes in from Martha. Martha wants to know how you get deep colors without so much food coloring that you can actually taste it. And does all of the icing drying affect the quality of the cookie?
So the first part of that question, mixing deep colors, is done. I like to do all of my color mixing the day before I decorate, and time is really your friend. The color will really deepen overnight. And so, for example, let's take black because I think that's the one color that a lot of times new decorators will struggle with. When I'm making that color, I'll mix it to a dark charcoal gray overnight. That will deepen in color, and I will see the next day if I really need to add more color or not. Sometimes I do. I feel like it needs to be a little bit deeper, but keep in mind that icing also dries darker than it appears when it's wet. So even if it looks still dark charcoal, you're going to have even a deeper color once that black icing is dry. If you have 1 cup of icing or 8 ounces of icing, it's probably not unrealistic to add a half a teaspoon of black food gel to that icing, which sounds like a lot because you usually think of it in drops. But if you actually measured it, I bet it would be between half a teaspoon, maybe closer to a teaspoon of that food gel to get those deep colors. If you're looking to reduce that amount, definitely make your colors the day before and just kind of let them develop. What was the second part of that question?
So after the food coloring question and avoiding tasting it, uh,
Yeah,
was the part about does the icing drying affect the
yeah.
quality of the cookie?
Uh, in my opinion, no, but I do like to complete the cookie process in 36 hours to get my cookies packed and sealed in a bag. And so typically I will bake the cookies the day before I decorate. Then I'll flood and decorate on day 2. And then on day 3 in the morning, I'll try to pack those cookies. But once you decorate that cookie, and it's sitting on your cookie sheet, there's really not much of the cookie that's really exposed to the air. That icing kind of seals in that freshness. So it is important to let that icing dry and let that cookie sit out overnight. I actually don't let them sit out out on the table. I'll store my cookies in the cool oven overnight or on the bakery rack with the cover zipped down. But I won't pack the cookies the same day for that reason that I mentioned earlier, that the moisture from the icing really needs to leave so that it doesn't get stirred up in that cookie package with the sticking. But I don't think you have to worry about the freshness of the cookie if you're kind of conscious about completing that process in 24 to 36 hours if you're able to do so.
Well, that's fantastic, because Celeste actually had a question about keeping cookies fresh. So you got some tips in there for that as well. Let's do a clarification question from Dondra, and then I think we'll have time for one or two more. This goes back to the question about the decorating time, and you had mentioned that it was around 7 to 8 hours for 4 dozen cookies. Dondra bakes and decorates cookies, and for her, that's about what it takes for 12 cookies, but not with basic decorating. So she's curious about what level of decorating are you talking about when you're giving that time frame?
Yeah, generally, when I'm talking about that time frame, let's say I'm doing 4 dozen cookies, I will limit the designs to 4 different designs. So I'm doing 1 dozen of each design, which really speeds up and streamlines that decorating process. One of those 4 designs is kind of the feature cookie, like a happy chick, and takes a little bit of effort, but is really fun to look at and really interesting. The other 3 cookies are going to be simple peeps or stenciling cookies, doing polka dot cookies and wet on wet designs. So those other 3 cookies are an accent cookie, and you mix those in to kind of keep that decorating time down. That's a concept that I definitely teach in that Smart Cookies class, is just how do you plan if you're doing 1 dozen cookies, but each cookie is a different design. Yes, your decorating time is going to be much higher. But I will say this, we all work at different decorating speeds, and that's why I suggest timing yourself. My time, might not be the same as your time. There's definitely going to be people that are going to decorate faster than me and people that decorate slower than me. We all decorate at different rates, but I really try to mix an interesting cookie with 3 accent cookies to keep that decorating time down. And I set those parameters when I'm working with a customer, just to let them know that this is the designs that I'm suggesting, because I know what they're paying for that cookie, and that's what fits into that price.
All right, let's finish here with a question from Jenna. Jenna is super new here. I love thicker cookies. Why do
Yes.
you choose to make yours flatter? And is there a benefit to either version?
So much about cookies in general is personal preference. What kind of texture do you like and taste is definitely just what you like. And so I like a cookie that has a little bit more texture, which is why I roll my cookies to a 1/4 inch thick. And I actually use these spacer sticks when I'm rolling out the dough, and I just put the dough between these sticks. And then once my rolling pin is rolling on the sticks, I know that my cookies are 1/4 inch thick. When you start getting into those thicker cookies, if it's a 3/8 or even I've seen 1/2 inch, then I feel like the cookie is getting softer and it just has a much softer bite. So for me, I like the texture. I think that's just how I grew up, was eating cookies with a little bit of a crunch to it. So that's my preference. And I like the deeper flavor. So I'll bake my cookies until they have a nice brown bottom to them, because I feel like that caramelization of the sugars in there, I just like the flavor of that. But again, that's personal preference. To somebody else, that might be overdone.
All right, well, with that said, Anne, I actually would love to open it up for any final thoughts that you might have, anything you'd like to send us off with today, this Friday afternoon, before I wrap things up and we say farewell. Go for it.
Yeah, I would just say thank you so much, Leah, for helping with the Q&A, and thanks for Craftsy for inviting me. I encourage you to jump into cookie decorating and just give it a couple of chances. It sounds like there are some new cookie decorators, people that are really just getting interested in this craft. And once you stick with it for those first couple of projects, things really start to click and become a lot more fun. I always think it's a craft with a very short learning curve that you can kind of do a few projects and you start really seeing the success at that point. So keep on decorating.
All right. With that said, before I let you go, I would like to run through just a quick few reminders. So if you did not join us right at the top of this Craftsy Chat, we were here with Ann Yorks and we covered a lot of ground. And if you got in a few questions, you can rewatch this chat because we did get some questions in towards the end that we talked about. So Ann talked about packing and shipping cookies. She talked about a couple of Craftsy classes that she recommends to take if you're looking into making this cookie decorating a little more than a hobby. We covered business tips and lots of questions about icing decorating, planning, all of those good things. So come back and rewatch this Craftsy Chat if you can, and keep coming back for more Craftsy Chats about cookie decorating and other fun projects. With that said, don't forget to grab your free download. It's all about royal icing. That's in the link in the description so that you can take that with you. And on behalf of Craftsy, Anne, and everybody else behind the scenes, we would like to say thank you for joining us today. Enjoy cookie decorating, and we will see you soon.